It's one thing to lie, but it is another thing to be unnecessarily misled. Grace and peace, everybody. Welcome to Sabbath School Study Group. My name is Chris Bailey, and this is part 3 of our 5-part series, Surprised by Grace. We've been looking at Rahab and seeing what God's grace did in her life, and we're going to keep going in this story. And we're going to encounter another group that deals with God's people and how they lied, but how the greater sin was the fact that the people of God believed the lie. Before we go, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. Please hit that like button. It helps others find this video. And we'd love to come to your church or school. All you have to do is send us an email. Don't worry about cost. Don't let money get in the way of mission. We're even willing to come at our own expense, but we're relying on you to extend the invitation. In Joshua chapter 9, beginning in verse number 3, it says that when the inhabitants of Gibeon, these are the folks we're talking about, heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and unto Ai, they did work wilily and went and made as if they had been ambassadors, and took old sacks upon their asses and wine bottles old and rent and bound up. These are a group of people known as the Gibeonites. They're hearing about how Israel is marching on. His truth is marching on. He took out Jericho, and then the Lord takes out eventually Ai, and the Gibeonites are getting a little nervous. So they make a decision contrary to Rahab. Rather than hearing about the goodness of God and asking for God to have grace on them like Rahab, they decide we're going to work for this grace. We're going to get in where we can fit in. So they make a plan to trick Israel in order to get a grace that God was willing to freely give. So in verse number 8, they said unto Joshua, we are thy servants. And then Joshua says to them, who are you? And from whence come ye? And here's what the Gibeonites said. We're from a very, very far country. Thy servants are come because of the name of the Lord thy God, for we have heard the fame of him and all that he did in Egypt. There was the lie. The lie was that they had come from very far, but no, in fact, they were very near. They were neighbors, and they were nervous neighbors because they did not want to be conquered like Jericho and Ai. So they tried to trick Israel into forming an allegiance. So as the story goes on, if you read it there, they tricked them into forming this league with them. And eventually, Joshua and the Israelites find out that, wait a minute, these guys aren't from far. These are neighbors. And eventually they realize their mistake. Now, what could they have done? Well, if you go and see what happens, it says in verse 16, it came to pass at the end of 3 days after they had made a league with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors and that they dwelt among them. They did not find out the truth until down the road. And the reason why the mistake of Israel was worse than the mistake of the Gibeonites was that if they had taken the time to ask God, God's grace was big enough for the Gibeonites. They didn't have to be conquered to the point of destruction, but they did have to surrender to God. They would have to yield their way to his. They would not have entered into league with folks who were actually their enemies, and the Gibeonites still would have been preserved. What the Gibeonites should have done is exactly what the Israelites could have done. Before marching forward, if they had just asked God and said, Lord, who are these people and how should we deal with them? How many pains, how much suffering would we avoid if before we march into tomorrow and before we make plans for the future, that we ask God to say, Lord, lead me today. That kind of today prayer will keep us from the mistakes of tomorrow, will keep us from the failures of the future. But being intentional to say, Lord, I know I have my way, but I don't want to be misled.